Dr. Sami Timimi, welcome to Conversations with Peter Boghossian. How are you today?
Well, I'm good, thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me to be on your show.
Yeah,
I'm
my
very
pleasure.
honored.
So, people who don't or less familiar with your work, you are a seasoned psychiatrist. You really are truly a prolific author and a visiting professor at the University of Lincoln, and you're known for your incisive commentary on mental health and cultural influences. So, one of the things that you've talked about that I'm going to dive right into that is absolutely fascinating to me, this has been a longstanding hypothesis of mine, is the mental health crisis tied to the decline of the West?
That's a big question and something that I've increasingly become preoccupied with.
Hmm.
I don't know if we can break it down because I feel like I have to walk people through
Please.
why I've come to the conclusion that there is a relationship. And I'm not wanting to simplify these things because, of course, there's always many moving parts in any society, any politics, any economy. And so sometimes it can seem like if you're trying to pick out a overarching grand narrative, you're oversimplifying things.
Okay. Well,
Um,
go for it.
so so it's a trend. So I think the starting point is my gradual realization, and I've been practicing as a child psychiatrist now for over 30 years. So I've had a lot of time to meet people, think about these things, and try and look at the various types of research. So I've been looking at research for a long time. And the first thing that I would like to propose as something that I would consider factual is that we literally don't know what we're talking about when it comes to mental health. So I've asked this question: what is mental health and what is mental disorder, to tens, maybe hundreds of different populations, from lay people to teachers, psychiatrists, psychologists, and your listeners might want to give that one a go themselves and see if they can answer that. And the one thing that all the answers have in common is that they're subjective.
Mm.
There is no, what we would call in scientific terms, there is no empirical anchor.
Mhm.
There is nothing concrete in the world out there of measurable facts that can be used to create an empirical starting point for your definitions. And if you think about it, when we think about mental health, we tend to think about how you're feeling or how you're functioning, and or being depressed, or being anxious, or losing touch with reality. These are all very subjective definitions. And when you compare that to, say, thinking about how you define something like a fracture. So if you've had a I don't know, slipped on some ice and you've fallen down, and your uh, hand has got swollen, and you can't clasp yourself into a palm, your hand into a fist, and you go to the accident and emergency. I think you call it emergency room
Mhm.
in the US.
We do.
Um, uh, you might get a X-ray for that, and it might reveal that there has been a fracture, for example, of the scaphoid bone or something like that. So now you have an empirical connection between the sources of suffering that you are experiencing. So it provides what's called a proximal cause.
Right.
Now
Okay.
there's and that is a starting point for defining a case, because now you can start collecting other examples of people who've fractured their scaphoid, and compare
Right.
all sorts of other things,
Is
including the treatments, including various things that might have led to you being more likely to uh, fracture your scaphoid, etc. So
okay.
you have a starting point for defining a case. But if you think about mental health, all the cases and the diagnoses that we use, they are basically based on descriptions. So, for example, if you look at the definitions for something like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, they all refer to the presence of certain behaviors, and they all start with the word often. So, take one of the symptoms, often squirms or fidgets um, in their seat. So, how often is often? What is the age group before you decide that's often? Who is it who's deciding it's often? And what's a unit of squirm? What's a unit of fidget? How long? How much do you have to move? You see the problem.
I do. Is my question is then, is that because of the vagaries of the human mind, whereas the human body does admit of so many degrees of freedom, if you will? So, or is it just a definitional thing? Is it that we haven't come to a consensus because we lack the anchors?
Um, I think uh, I think it's important to understand that diagnostic riddles are still part of a lot of medicine. So they're not unique to psychiatry in some ways, but at least in the most of the rest of medicine, you have an empirical starting point in which to define a group of cases.
Right.
But when it comes to what we're defining as mental health, you're talking about experiences, you're talking about behaviors, and these experiences can be interpreted in a variety of different ways. So, for example, just take the experience of, just in very broad terms, the idea of suffering. Now, in a lot of other cultures and a lot of religions, suffering is seen as something meaningful. Suffering is often seen as something that leads to growth, and that being alive, there's an inevitability to suffering. But when you define suffering as something that is due to some condition, let's call it depression, then it's extracted from any cultural meaning. It just becomes suffering, just becomes meaningless torture.
How come the people who believe that suffering has some great meaning, why don't, when they go to the dentist, why don't they just ask to not have Novocaine?
Um, so I'm talking about mental suffering, and it's an interesting question about the relationship of that with pain. And some people do think, and I think there's some merits in this, that the introduction of anesthesia, and it was a very important thing because it enabled all sorts of operations and surgeries and things that we wouldn't have been able to do with people who are conscious. I mean, we used to do them. But when we get to the position that we're trying to eliminate all pain,
Hmm.
and we're kind of getting to the point where living with any type of suffering is seen as something that can be eliminated, we start moving towards a conception of the human condition which is unrealistic.
Hmm.
All all life involves some degree of suffering, and you have to learn to understand it. Sometimes it's learning just to tolerate it.
Okay.
There's
So,
a
so
there's a
let me.
wonderful um, there was a wonderful paper by a colleague of mine called John Uridini, a psychiatrist, a child psychiatrist in Australia. The title of the paper was "Let the Children Cry," and his whole argument was we've become so averse to the idea that growing up involves mental pain that we are trying to eliminate the necessary um, trials and tribulations and struggles involved with growing up. And when we do that, we are reducing people's resilience. We're reducing their ability to find a way through life and deal with the sorts of hardships that life is inevitably going to throw at you.
Yeah,
It caused a lot of controversy because he was basically arguing we're trying to treat too much.
it reminds me of Wernicke's definition of meaning is that which justifies suffering. So before when you talked about doing away with when you talk about empirical anchors, so it sounds like the West values having these empirical anchors, and critical social justice wants to do away with that. Kind of follows the subjective turn. So let's get back to the question of, we've kind of set some of the stage and some of the background, and I guess we have to define what we mean by the decline of the West.
So just if you like, the next stage, why I wanted to just mention that we literally don't know what we're talking about when it comes to mental health is because it means it's extremely vulnerable to what I call the elastic band effect. In other words, we can start stretching concepts. So we might have started with a group of people who were, if you like, you know, quite incapacitated with their mental health problems and needing, various types of support. But because we have no place at which to start making objective definitions or definitions that go beyond the imagination of the diagnoser, these concepts can just keep opening, opening, opening.
Interesting.
And the next step with that is that because we live in a market-based economy, and because these concepts are potentially highly lucrative, what we've ended up with is a whole host of psychiatric diagnoses, not all of them, but the ones that really resonate with the types of everyday anxieties that people have, which tend to be those related to behavior problems amongst children.
Fascinating.
And that tends to be mainly boys. And
Fascinating.
with
Yeah.
adults, it tends to be those related to senses of insecurity, anxiety, low self-esteem, and that tends to be mainly women.
Hmm.
And what then happens is that what we call psychiatric diagnoses actually turn into commercial brands.
Hmm.
And so the successful
Interesting.
commercial brands develop a whole host of products around them, from pharmaceuticals to particular therapies to online books or courses, institutes, etc., etc. So you can get a sense of where in the culture the anxieties and the growth of that sense of, there's something wrong with our children, or there's something wrong with me, I don't fit in, I don't feel part of this world, I'm very anxious, by what diagnoses or what psychiatric brands, if you like, have become more popular.
So we've pathologized then what is the claim that these are just natural features of the human condition, and we've medicalized and pathologized them?
Um, they see there's something very odd about the whole way we approach diversity, because if we approach diversity as diversity of the humans are, well, you've got 7+ billion forms of diversity because every person is unique. But because we've turned these things into brands, we're kind of putting forward a very complicated human typology. We're classifying people into these boxes, and certain boxes are becoming more common. So the ones that are growing are things like ADHD, autism, bipolar disorder, depression, and we'll see other ones coming along behind them. But these are very lucrative brands, and
Okay,
they kind of suggest two
you
things.
have to slow down a little bit, because I just want to make sure that this is
Mm.
completely clear. So is the claim and then we'll get back to what that suggests. Are you claiming that these things are that they don't exist at all, or that we're just including them in the lexicon? We're like making a word for this phenomena, but or are you claiming that the phenomena is just naturalistic and there's some kind of distribution among the population? Like what? I'm not sure what the claim is. Is the claim that the whole thing has been medicalized and pathologized?
There's a bit of both going on.
Okay.
So we, uh, all of us, for example, have degrees of sociability. Let's just take that as a. Some people are just
Okay.
naturally more sociable than others.
Like Reed, very sociable.
Huh? Yeah.
Reed is very sociable.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah.
So some people are more sociable than others. Others are less so, and also all sorts of other. That's what I mean by, in terms of diversity, we're all unique. Um, Now, if you start putting different meanings onto that sociability, you start not only discovering that some people are less sociable than others, for example, but you start implying certain things about the nature of their sociability. So if you start adding the word
Huh.
disorder
Huh.
after it,
Huh. Interesting.
I mean, we've known about labeling for decades. Sociologists have looked into this and have seen the power of labeling in all sorts of ways. Whether whether it's to do with labeling people's, and I don't know if you I've come across the classic brown eyes, blue eyes study that
Mm.
happened.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
so labeling is very powerful. So we kind of then we speak certain things into existence. If we start thinking that these types of behaviors are the products of a disorder, as opposed to part of just the diversity, you will start interpreting those behaviors in certain ways. So now, instead of just accepting them, you might want to change them, because if you've defined them as symptoms, well, what do you do with symptoms? If it's a medical disorder, you try and reduce them or get rid of them. So you've already created a whole set of meanings which makes it hard to accept certain behaviors. For example, the types of behaviors that maybe describe ADHD. And people themselves are going to get that message. Parents are going to be stressed about how to help their child with these behaviors. Schools will feel that they need to do something and might want to refer them on.
They help them through
And
medicine. Medicine is
yeah,
one
whether
avenue.
it's medicine or psychotherapy or going to some parenting group. So you've already created a big set of meanings. And if you look at some of the research, just take, for example, ADHD, there's a couple of recent studies, one in Ireland and one in Australia, that followed up a group of children and they used questionnaires, and they found that they compared people who had the same sort of behaviors, who got a diagnosis of ADHD, and those who didn't get a diagnosis, even though they had the same behaviors. And they followed them through their childhood, and they found that the ones who had these, in both the Irish and Australian study, the ones who got the diagnosis, by the time they were in their early teens or late teens, it depends on, the early teens was the Irish study, the late teens was the Australian study, they had lower self-esteem, they had poorer social skills, they had a greater likelihood of feeling that they were failing in all sorts of ways, they were more likely to be anxious. So these things have effects.
So
Um,
Sorry, go ahead.
yeah,
Continue.
yeah,
Go ahead.
carry on. Yeah.
Oh, me carry on. Okay, carry
Yeah.
on, carry on. That's very English of you. So the ADHD, it is a biological phenomenon, even if you don't label it. But when you place that in the context of people sitting still in the classroom, it's very different from people who are escaping tigers and hunting gazelles, right? So it had a different evolutionary adaptive function. Whereas now we've changed the conditions and so it's easy to see why people who exhibit those traits, that why that would be a negative. And then once it's a negative, we label it, we pathologize it. To a certain extent, we stigmatize it, maybe not. And then we treat it in some way because we look at it as not a good thing.
Yeah, I'm very familiar with the kind of hunter versus farmer analogy, and the whole idea of adaptive traits. It's a bit too simplistic for me. I
Okay.
think I think these types of behaviors, of course, they're going to be adaptable, but not just because we were hunters, but in all sorts of situations, people who
No,
can be
sure,
respond
sure.
very quickly, Um, so I just see it as part of the diversity that makes up people. But there is something more that happens. So, for example, uh, there was a couple of social anthropologists back in the 1950s who were married. They were both called the Fisher. So the Fisher studies are a classic study of a small town. I think it was in New Hampshire, and they just talked to and looked at the opinions and beliefs of parents and teachers in this small town around children and behavior problems. So these was the days before we'd even invented the idea of ADHD. And basically and these studies are quite interesting because it's quite interesting to look at what people's opinions, beliefs and practices around behaviors that we would now label and try
Mhm.
and change. So most of the parents and the teachers tend to share an opinion that children um, go through stages where they might be oppositional, or they might be difficult, or they might be impulsive, and they expected many of them to grow out of it, but they also believed that it was wrong to interfere with these types of things too much because it might ruin the child's development. So
Interesting.
if you even within our own culture, and I've looked at the understanding of childhood and child development across cultures in a number of my other studies and books and articles. So you see these varieties of opinions and beliefs around the nature of childhood and how people responded to what we would consider to be behavioral problems. And to me, there is something of a growing um, of a growing impatience with children and a growing impatience with what you might just consider childishness. Um, and that seems to have been happening in Western culture over the past few decades. So we've expanded hugely the numbers of people who are getting different types of psychiatric diagnoses.
Mm,
Um, One of the things that's changed in my lifetime as a child psychiatrist is, for example, childhood depression. Childhood depression, when I was training back in the 1990s, was considered to be extremely rare, different to adult depression, and not amenable to treatment with any medication, and usually considered to be the outcome of abuse and trauma. So it was very much thought of in psychosocial terms.
mm,
But childhood depression now is probably the most common diagnosis that is around. So
mhm,
children now are considered if to be getting depressed. Now that was a very adult idea. So it was felt before that children weren't psychologically developed enough to recognize and for us to think of it in the same terms. Similar thing happened with bipolar disorder. That was never considered to be. What's going on in the UK at the moment is there's a debate around personality disorders and making early diagnosis of personality disorders. This is kind of, to me, this is crazy stuff. Children are not allowed. The one of the things that I've always tried to impress on people, which is one of the things that I learned and I consider myself in some ways a traditional child psychiatrist, um, which is that children change. And that's a broad concept of development. That's the one constant, is that children change and you just don't know in which way they're going to change. So if you start closing down that idea of change by putting them in a bracket from early on in their life, you're limiting yourself, your child, and other people's understanding of them and their potential.
So
And
is
the other
this?
thing is,
Yeah. Go
Mhm.
ahead. No, go ahead.
and and the other thing is that you cannot understand children, and now I think people in general, without understanding their broad context. What are the beliefs around them? What is the happening in their family? What is
Sure.
happening in their communities?
And so are these things the overdiagnosis, the pathologizing, the medicalization? Are these things symptoms of the decline of empire, or are they caused by the decline of empire?
That's a really interesting, in some ways that's a chicken and egg question, isn't it?
You've come to the
Um,
right place, doctor. You're in conversations with Peter Boghossian. We ask the hard questions here.
yeah, yeah. Um, uh, so what's happened in my 30 plus year career, is that I've noticed this expansion, and I really noticed it in the COVID lockdown era and
Yeah.
after coming out of COVID lockdown. These trends were already there. So we were already talking about these mental health epidemics, and the young people in particular are the ones who are really suffering. And after the coming out of lockdown, and all the disruptions that caused for young people in their learning, in their socializing, we saw an even more rapid expansion. So referral rates went up. And
Hmm.
then I started looking into some of the literature around on the numbers of referrals and what are the types of problems being presented. And I was starting to see some things that really got me wondering what the hell is going on. So, for example, a survey of 1,000 children in the UK found that 68% of them believed they have had or had a mental health problem. There'd also been I mean, that
Wow.
we're
That's
talking
just
about
shocking.
nearly three quarters
Yeah, I know.
who've
That's just
come to believe that. Where
shocking.
did they get these ideas from?
Yeah, it's shocking.
Um, the, so uh, and referral rates jumped by about 45% as we came out of lockdown, and so we were then discovering all the sort of stories that um, and so here what we have a clear psychosocial event
Mm,
that um, happened to people, and as they come out of it, they come to believe that what's happened to them is causing some sort of mental disorder that requires professional attention, not
mm,
something that they can, with them and their families, they can find a way through. What we were seeing as well was a shift in a lot of the schools. We started a whole thing to do with placing more counselors in schools who are now identifying more children, and they were referring them on.
the
So
problem is
teachers were kind of relieved of doing the kind of ordinary things.
mm,
Yeah, a little story from some research that my daughter did in her undergraduate degree. She talked to teachers about their practice around mental health and how things were changing. And one teacher said that this kid came in and he was really upset, so he sat him down and talked to him, and that seemed to help. And the next day he asked him how was he doing, and the kid said, yeah, I'm doing okay. And then he spoke to his senior, um, and the senior was shocked and said, you shouldn't have done that, because what if he had a mental disorder? It's not your place to make those sorts of things, because you're not a professional, and therefore you might have made things worse for this kid.
Wow.
So ordinary things start going out of the window,
Wow.
if you're
Let,
following me.
I do. Let me we have two super chats. People want your opinion on something. So let's see. Kay asks, is this a semantic contagion? Is it just is it just that we've either expanded the semantic range of terms or that well anyway, I'll let you answer.
Yeah. There are a number of concepts that are used, which I think are very relevant. So one concept is called looping.
Hmm.
So looping is it's easy to understand. I mean, there's nothing complicated about it. The more you talk about something, the more people notice it. The more people notice it, the more they talk about it. So if you start talking about, oh, this could be symptoms of ADHD, and you read a article, and then you're getting more people thinking, oh, maybe my son or myself have ADHD,
Hmm.
you're going to get
Interesting.
more people going to the doctor. The doctor refers more people. Now more services are needed. Therefore, now there's more research going on. There's more people talking about it, and so you get this.
Looping.
So that's the looping effect. It's a social. It's a kind of a social amplification around a particular concept. So we get a looping effect. Social contagion is similar to what that person is referring to in terms of
Okay.
semantic contagion. So social media is great at social contagion, and in lockdown, a lot of kids were on social media. They were seeing
Yep.
videos of this influencer and that. Oh, I've just been diagnosed with ADHD, and this is how I recognize. And they start thinking, oh my God, I've got that as well. And it's almost
Fascinating.
glamorized in some
Yeah.
ways. So social contagion. And the final one in these concepts is what's called concept creep. And that might be closest to, which is what I've been talking about. You start with something that has maybe a nugget of reality, but because it's subjective, and so what's been happening in Western culture is concept creep around various types of harm.
Mm,
So we've had not only concept creep with mental health, but we've had concept creep with things like our ideas of what bullying is.
mm,
We've had concept creep with our idea of what gender is.
mm.
We've had concept creep
Excellent.
in all
Yeah,
of
yeah.
these ways. So and our ideas about types of identity. So
Interesting.
in terms of coming back to that original question
Yeah, and then but
about the decline of the Western Empire, sorry,
before you
go on.
do that, you one of the things, the second point you mentioned was social media. I
Mm,
wanted to ask a question. We had a Trader Bears, a friend of the show, asked the question: phones and social media are frying all of our brains, let alone kids. It's it seems to me we should look at the causes of ADHD in historic numbers before medicating our children. So there is some kind of a loop in which,
mhm.
like you said, either well, I'll just let you answer the question.
Um, Social media is kind of interesting because I think people have rightly and understandably panicked about it. One of the things it can cause is social contagion, which we were discussing. Um, but sometimes I think each generation has to discover something about the next generations that they're shocked about. And if you go back, people thought that the invention of television was about to rot a generation's brain. Maybe it did, I don't know. Um, uh, but one of the things that's happened is another concept that's, I think, relevant is referred to as the domestication of childhood. that childhood used to be a lot more out doing things
That's how mine
and
was.
doing things away from adult supervision.
That's how mine was. Yeah.
So so there was a more lively kids culture, if you like, where what happened between kids happened between kids. Um, this generation have a lot more adult supervision, a lot more understandable concern about what might happen to children if they're outside of adult supervision, who might be preying on them, etc., etc. So their chance of creating a sort of children's culture away from the prying eyes of adults has been reduced. But I think in some ways they found it through social media.
Mm,
They
interesting.
found a space where they can. So some people, um, that is a place where they can have that bit of kid culture. But I think for those who are more vulnerable to, for example, if you're being picked on, or you can't leave it at the school gates. It will follow you home if you're on social media. And even though you could just turn it off, a lot of kids won't do that because also their friends and so on are there. So it's not one dimensional, but it
Yeah.
certainly is an important factor.
So getting back to is the mental health crisis tied to the decline of the West? We've set some of the stage and the background for that now.
Yeah. So this is the bits where I guess it's much more interpretive, and people will have different opinions. So I'm not as fixed on this. I think what I've spoken about so far is much more closely related to the factual. These are phenomena that are occurring. Um, so there are two things that I think are pointers towards, if you accept my idea that psychiatric diagnoses are now just commercial brands, then they potentially serve one function. Is they create new markets. So in a market-driven economy, these become sources of profit. And the fact that they have expanded enormously suggests that there's a lot of profit to make, which suggests that there's a population that's feeling insecure and feeling that it needs something to feel better in some sort of way. So
A
that is one
crisis.
thing.
It could be the crisis of meaning.
And a crisis of meaning is, I think, very much also part of that. And the other thing is it distracts, or it turns what might be thought of as social, political, or cultural issues into individual issues to be solved by a technology.
Mm,
So, for example, I
interesting.
spoke about what happened with COVID. I mean, that was an enormous social, political, and economic event. But the rapid expansion of people who then considered that they had a mental disorder, it almost seemed like that's a good way for governments to get out of looking at what they did and what happened and what the implications are for, we're social beings, for the sorts of things that went on.
Yeah.
So it becomes a
Yeah.
convenient way of moving it out of the sphere of political and economic and things that need to be addressed in that sphere, and into the sphere of how do we help people with their mental health now. So you turn it into something to be solved between the ears rather than in the social spaces that people live in.
Could it be that the large scale phenomenon of thinking you have a mental disorder is itself a cultural phenomenon? It's like a culture bone syndrome.
Absolutely. That's
Yeah.
that's 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 certainly what I've been
Okay. So
suggesting, that we're expanding, but um, that the experiences that people have, and I can tell you from, my consulting room, they're visceral. People are experiencing quite debilitating, quite often, suffering. And they come to believe that they have no agency over changing that there has to be some sort of expert intervention, and that the problem resides in them rather than they are reacting in an understandable and entirely human way to certain challenges that have confronted them. And that's a very different frame of reference to help people get a handle on what's
Sure.
going on in their life and re-empower them.
Sure.
Um,
That would mean, though, and correct me if my reasoning is an error here. That would mean, though, that it wouldn't be indicative or a marker of end of empire or a symptom of end of empire. It would just mean that it was just causally, you could posit why, one could posit why, but it would just be a cultural bound syndrome that was not indicative of anything deeper or more pronounced.
uh, yes. Um, as I said, that is, I'm simply suggesting of one way of interpreting this extraordinary exponential rise in the number of people who are coming forward and believing and suffering, that they have. So there's this individualization going on. And I think COVID was the one that made me understand this relationship between social phenomena and how it gets turned into an individual problem to be solved by some sort of expert. Now, if you look, I guess the next bit is for me thinking more broadly about, I think there is a general sense of pessimism and insecurity, and a sense that there's something broken in our society, in our economy. And you hinted at it as well in terms of a sense of meaning that comes from a kind of an empty consumerism that doesn't seem to fill those gaps that result in that sense of insecurity and that sense of not fitting in and that sense that something's wrong.
Are there any commonalities among the people who, because I'm thinking in the back of my mind again, it's the crisis of meaning, and maybe there's just not enough meaning, and they substitute the lack of meaning for suffering, which then gives them meaning. Are there commonalities among the people who really, because you used the word visceral, I thought that was a good word to
Mm.
use. Are there commonalities among the people who have this visceral experience of suffering, or is it just there are no kind of emerging psychological, psychiatric themes that you can pick from the distribution?
The main thing that I've noticed is um, an increase in that sense of anxiety, in that sense of um, so that some people that I've met have a general sense of what's what you might refer to as existential anxieties
Mhm.
alongside their sort of not being able to go out the house or meet
Right.
up with friends or whatever else is going on. But that sense of what's the point of my life? Where do I fit in? What's my future about? Um, and I've had some conversations with some people that really got me thinking about that, and people were just saying that they just generally feel what's the point? What's the future? Things are not going well. I
But the
can't see where it's going to get
oh,
better.
I see. So I got you.
Yeah.
I got you. Now I see. So that's the end of empire stuff. So they
Mm,
look at the future and they're like, "Oh man, what's the point of all this?" I mean, the
mm. What?
the I mean, the response my response to that would be, "Well, the point is what you make the point to be." I mean, people ask me how I'm doing all the time, and I tell them I'm great. My life is awesome. The whole civilization is falling apart, but I personally am
Mm,
doing great. So the isn't the idea then, you know, you make your own meaning. Meaning is not something on high that's objective, that's out there. It's something that you bestow. It's something that you
So
find. Yeah,
um, maybe I'll introduce another concept which might help. Um,
please.
Ethan Waters, who is an anthropologist and journalist, wrote a great book called Crazy Like Us. And it was about the expansion of Western ways of looking at mental health across the world and into cultures that have very different ways of understanding what we would call mental health. But he made a point which was useful, that there is not an infinite way of expressing distress, and that each culture has a set of narratives or things that, yeah, that's the book, or things that people understand as culturally congruent ways of expressing your distress. But where do they get these ideas from?
Mhm.
So, for example, self harm has become a big thing. A lot of young people
I know.
use self harm, and I'm seeing people younger and younger using self harm, and they hear about it. So they hear about it in conversations, in the media, with their friends, from professionals, and so on and so forth. In other words, our ideas about how we make sense of things, including isn't infinite. It has to come from somewhere. Not all of us, and particularly when we're younger, we are going to be influenced by the stories that are percolating in our culture. And I think there's a lot percolating in our culture that's quite pessimistic. Even if we try sometimes to be more optimistic, and it's important to try and do that wherever you can. And there's all sorts of ways of finding meaning. And I hope, at least in some of my clinical work, I'm trying to help people get back from this idea that what's the point? Where is this all going?
Yeah.
But so there are this sense is, I think, getting into people's heads that there's something that is that we're kind of,
Mm,
you know, what's the expression, pissing against the wind,
mm.
that that we're beset by crisis after crisis. Whatever we do, we don't seem to be able to get out of something. Economy grows a bit and then declines again. Inequality is increasing. Essential services don't work, well, at least in
So
this country.
yeah,
Uh,
NIH. So I've often wondered what would happen because it's so obvious to me that things are going to get worse in the short term, when the
yeah.
US defaults on its debt. And I mean, what's going to happen when something real happens, like when an actual crisis happens? I mean, how are these people? I'm thinking of social workers in particular, but like, how are these people going to cope with it when there's something real?
So you had an example of that with COVID and post-COVID. That was something very real. It disrupted our usual social, and it caused economic havoc to a lot of families, and a lot of insecurities. So I think we got a taste of that, of what it might look like. And interestingly enough, it wasn't during COVID that all of these, the suicide rate did not go up. Rates of self-harm, in fact, they kind of almost went down in certain areas. It was as we came out, it was like the aftermath. And we often see that with people who have traumatic experiences. When you're going through a situation, you're often in a survival mode. And it's often, quite often afterwards, that it kind of catches up with you. So I don't know what it's going to be like, but it's going to be tough.
Okay, so let's go back to the original question. So, is the mental health crisis tied to the decline of the West?
Okay, and there was one other strand which I guess we haven't touched upon
All right, let's do
much,
that. Let's do that.
and it's to do with the growth of identity politics and what I see as now a merger with what I'm increasingly calling the mental health industrial complex. So if you look at, I'm not an economist, but I'm interested in economics. So this is a rather amateurish sort of overview. But if you look at the post-war years and the growth of the dominance, particularly the dominance of the dollar, and the growth of Western economies, it was a kind of a thought of as a golden age, sometimes referred to as welfare capitalism. You know, welfare states came into being, and trade unions had some strength, and there was a reduction in levels of inequality. And then things started to hit the buffer first in the 1970s. And that's when economics started turning towards the models which we often refer to as neoliberal, although in terms of models of capitalism, there isn't an alternative now. It's basically this. And we had people like Thatcher and Reagan, even though it was started before them, but they were the ones who really took these ideas and started privatizing a lot of industry. Sometimes people think that that was associated with a decline of state. Actually, the state has carried on increasing throughout, the size of the state and bureaucracies, etc. But the real sign that this had triumphed, this model of capitalism had triumphed, was when Bill Clinton and Tony Blair came into power. Margaret Thatcher in interviews was once asked what was her greatest achievement, and she answered Tony Blair, because they adopted the same model. So class economics was out of the window. So what was the left? That was a double left. But what was the left? What remained for the left to, if you like, fight politically on? So this was the start of the left turning towards an idea of representation. This is
Interesting.
the area where we could now fight the right on, is instead of actually looking at an economic system and thinking about it in terms of class and what might be better for the working class, we can now say this is about classism and respect for the people of the working class. And we can now talk about in the way to solve racism is through creating more people who are from racial minorities, who are CEOs of companies, or more often in adverts, or so it became visibility based issues. So this turns it away from, if you like, large social groupings into minority groups of various types for whom you fight for their rights. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Of course, there were many good things that have come out of trying to combat various types of racism or sexism, and so on. But it hasn't resolved the basic structural issues, which are basically class issues. And so mental health ideology seems to be consistent with that idea. And so what has emerged in certain types of mental health campaigning against medicalization is talking about things like autism and ADHD not as disorders, but as differences, minority groups for whom there should be rights. And we've seen similar things with, for example, gender and trans rights and so on. Again, I'm not trying to I'm not trying to dismiss the importance of treating everybody with respect, and that everybody should have access to, shouldn't be discriminated on in terms
Of
of their
course.
housing, education, etc., etc. But what it does is it shifts the idea of political change away from empowering, if you like, a collection of working class people at the bottom of the socioeconomic scale, who do the everyday jobs, who come from all sorts of different backgrounds, and it shifts the battleground. I mean, you're seeing it now in the um, elections in your country. I think it shifts the battleground onto this idea of, oh, we've got a black woman president.
Yeah, I've
That's
often
now that shows us. I mean, the irony is, the last but one prime minister in this country, in the UK, had the most the most racially and sexually diverse cabinet in the history, but it was also the one with the highest number of private school educated and millionaires and people from very moneyed backgrounds. So that type of diversity does nothing for these structural and economic. And one of the things that it hides is the extent to which inequality is growing at an unsustainable level. And so we keep pumping more money into the economy, and a larger proportion of that money is going upwards rather than downwards, and it just seems to be aggravating that problem. And that type of left politics, which is also now infiltrated into mental health. So the whole neurodiversity and the trans and the gender expression movement is very mixed up with the whole mental health what I call the mental health industrial complex. So that's where I think is another sign of a culture that is turning towards these identitarian issues because of an inability to face, I guess, in some ways, an economic crisis that probably goes back to the 1970s. This has sort of been developing over time, but particularly since 2008, it just feels like it's crisis after crisis,
housing crisis. Yeah, yeah, I see.
militarism,
Yeah.
etc., etc. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Have you found in your practice, or is there any data to support this? And there's a little alarm bell going off in my head when I say data to support this, but it seems to me that the people who, the more identitarian one is, the more of a mental disorder one seems to have. The more one forwards identity issues, the more psychologically unhinged they are. Go ahead. Yeah. So you're nodding your head. Go ahead.
Yeah, I wouldn't use the phrase psychologically unhinged, but the more
Oh, I would.
that's fine. Um, but the more troubled they are, I think it's often a sign of. I mean, I say I say that I've had some of the most interesting conversations actually in my practice with people who are deeply troubled and are trying to think about this bigger picture stuff, and they're questioning their gender identity. They're often quite identified with being neurodivergent, and these all seem to go together these
Oh,
days.
I see. So let me
And
pause you and ask you a question. So you're
mm,
saying it's troubled as opposed to unhinged because unhinged is pejorative and troubled is neutral.
yeah, yeah,
Okay. Okay, I can see
because
why you that framing.
yeah,
Yeah.
these are, and one of the reasons why I have some really interesting conversations with them is because they're trying to grapple with these deeper questions about what does it mean to be a person at this moment in time, at this in my life. What does it mean to become a woman? What does it mean to, what type of uh, what does it mean to fit in? What am I trying to fit in into? And I've had some really fascinating conversations with young people who are really trying to grapple with these, bigger questions about the meaning of life. And I feel really upset, I think, that we're trying to push people into these categories as if that provides them with answers. For a lot of people, it just creates new questions. So I've seen so many people over the years who've maybe got several diagnoses, now identify as neurodivergent, still not feeling quite right. So they come back and they think, well, maybe it's because actually I was a man, even though I was born into a woman's body. And then later on, they've made that decision, yes, and they try to live like that, but still they're not. So maybe it's because actually I have a bipolar disorder, and so what? This is a group of people I'm seeing more often now who start while they're trying to grapple with this sense of what the hell's going on. They're trying to answer it by the things that we've provided them as a culture, which is a whole set of
Terrifying.
these diagnoses, which are also
Terrifying.
identity categories, and it's not good.
I, not only is it not good, I cannot possibly see why people would think that this would be virtuous or good or noble or helpful or uh, in 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 I don't get improved therapy outcomes. Like I don't. So what's the reasoning behind this? Or is it there is no reasoning behind this? It's just the broad phenomenological identification of a category that matches people, or it's that before we need to queer everything now and we need to rip down these traditional categories. I mean, so what's the thinking behind this? Because I would be shocked if the thinking were some kind of first principle like the amelioration of suffering.
Um, are you asking what's the thinking behind why, as a culture or as individuals, we're going down this path?
No, I'm thinking more about therapists and how well,
Oh,
actually, you could ask the question, but go ahead.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, therapy. Yeah, the therapy world. You mean why we're going
Yeah.
down the path of all of these
Yeah.
diagnoses and all of these? Um,
I have my
well,
own
I,
answer to that, but I want to hear yours.
well, like I said, I think of these categories now more as brands, psychiatric brands. So partly there is money in them, but there's also kind of a cultural kudos because that seems to be the zeitgeist.
Mm,
That's where kind of left politics, and I consider myself traditional left, who thought of, in terms of class categories, rather than, and socioeconomic inequality, and trying to improve, trying to reduce socioeconomic inequality. But the zeitgeist now seems to be that to improve people's lives, we have to create, we have to relieve ourselves of the idea that there is material reality to people's lives. I mean, sex is binary. That to me is a fact. But how you express that, gender roles is socially constructed. There are different gender ways of thinking about how the sexes then understand their role and how society treats the different roles. But we're trying to uh, we're trying to come up with an idea that there is no biology involved in sex. So where do people, how do, and it's, um, I feel like I've been through I went through the whole postmodern stage, and I think in recent years I feel like I'm coming out of that again, where you question everything and everything can be socially constructed. But no, there's a material world out there. And this is similar with the whole thing of neurodiversity. So we've got this idea that's become very fashionable that reality comes from within and is projected out into the world. If this is the way I feel, that
Subjective
is the
term.
reality.
Yeah. The
Whereas
primacy of
for me,
subjectivity. Yeah. Yeah.
there is a material world, and our subjectivity reflects that material world. We can't invent things that aren't there. So, I mean, there is no evidence that people who are, get a diagnosis of ADHD or autism have something characteristically different about their nervous system. And it kind of makes sense. Everybody's neurodiverse. If you take away neurodiversity and neurotypical, if you take away the neuro bit, you're just left with diverse and typical, which is kind of a bit pointless, really. So there's this idea that we have to squeeze people into these very individualistic categories, which in a way breaks down the idea of broader social categories.
Hmm.
So and then what you have is these groups who have minority rights, who are fighting for their minority rights, and you can be an ally, but you can't speak about topics that they're speaking about because you're not one of them. And it kind of creates it kind of creates this cancel culture that I see coming from both the right and left in different ways, which makes it very hard. It makes it hard for me sometimes because there's this idea that if you're not affirming somebody's concept of what their gender is, for example, or their diagnosis, and I don't want to rain on anybody's parade, but I think it's up to me also to create a situation where difficult conversations can happen so that
If only
we can
someone wrote a book about that. I
widen
don't know.
people's widen rather than narrow people's possibilities. Um, but that seems to be where we're at. And there's a kind of a concreteness which verges sometimes on paranoia, like as if we allowed some of these conversations to open up, we're going to oppress people. But that's kind of, to
Next thing you
me,
know,
it's
people be
the
goose.
opposite.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So a few things in closing. We're coming to the end of our time here.
Yeah.
Tell us briefly. You wrote a book, and Reed will pull it up, about insanity, the culture of insanity, and what's the thesis of that book? Insane medicine.
Yeah, it's a bit of a play on words. Insane medicine, psychiatry, but also
Right. Sure.
something's going on in psychiatry that has become a little bit insane in itself. And the
Right.
basic thesis is that if you look at the evidence on outcomes from treatment, we've had about 4 or 5 decades of various types of research, including the what's often referred to as the gold standard randomized controlled trial, and the outcomes have been disappointing. There's no progress being made. Some studies say outcomes as a result of treatment has maybe got worse. And so we've got what is often referred to as the
Worse.
yeah,
That's gotten
we've got
worse.
what is referred to as the treatment prevalence paradox.
Mm.
In those societies, which tend to be the more developed societies, where there has been greater access to treatment, we seem to have had a growth in the prevalence of mental disorders. If we were being successful, you'd expect at least a stabilization, but hopefully a decline. If you look at other bits of
That's,
medicine,
yeah.
if you look at other branches of medicine, we've made progress in, helping people from heart attacks in terms of how longer they live, or their survivability in terms of cancer outcomes, in terms of treating various types of infections, in terms of there's a lot of areas where we've made progress because we know how to class a case, we know how to there are still areas where there is a lot of similar problems, not the same. So a lot of neurology has some similar issues, but psychiatry tends to be unique in this rapid expansion of interventions, many of which don't seem to be resulting in improvements in outcomes. So this book was really about trying to look at that evidence. I looked specifically at case examples. The two case examples I used was autism and ADHD, and to use them as case studies about this phenomena, that nothing seems to stop the growth in popularity of making these diagnoses and the treatments, despite the lack of evidence that they're leading to population-wide improvements in mental health.
Cool. Okay. So, doctor, you've been very generous with your time. Where can people find you?
I'm not very good at advertising myself, but there's my website. That's sami.timimi.co.uk. I have to say I don't visit it very often and update it, but you can get some basic ideas about some of the stuff I've written and some of the previous interviews I've given and some of the books I've written.
And you are you on Twitter or X or any other social media platforms?
I think I am.
Okay, so that tells us you don't.
Use
Okay,
them
so that's
very
all
often.
we need to know.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your time, and keep your
Oh, there you go.
there you go. Thanks, Reed. Thank you very much for your time. We appreciate your insights and look forward to hearing from you more. And once again, keep your browser open. Reed, thanks for doing what you do. We appreciate it. All right, everybody. Thanks for the chats. Thanks for the super chats, and we appreciate it. And once again, doctor, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Pleasure. Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. This falls under the umbrella of my nonprofit, National Progress Alliance. Your generous donations keep us going and help fuel content like this. We truly appreciate your support. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next one.